The morning sun beat down mercilessly on Camp Henderson as Lieutenant Sarah Martinez adjusted her combat boots and checked her weapon one final time. At 28, she had already earned respect among her peers through countless training exercises and 2 overseas deployments. Her compact frame and steady brown eyes often fooled new recruits into underestimating her capabilities, a mistake they rarely made twice. Today marked the annual combat training evaluation, where soldiers would demonstrate their hand-to-hand combat skills before the entire battalion. 282 soldiers had gathered in the large training arena, forming a perfect square around the designated combat zone. The atmosphere buzzed with anticipation and nervous energy as conversations echoed across the packed dirt floor. Colonel James Blackwood stood at the center of attention, his imposing 6'3" frame casting a long shadow across the training ground. At 51, he commanded respect through a combination of military excellence and an intimidating presence that had served him well throughout his 27-year career. His steel gray hair was cropped short in regulation style, and his pale blue eyes seemed to assess every person around him with calculating precision. The colonel had built his reputation on being tough, uncompromising, and absolutely convinced of his own superiority. He believed strongly that women had no place in combat roles, despite the military's evolving policies. His old-school mentality clashed frequently with the changing dynamics of modern warfare, but his rank protected him from most criticism. Sarah had heard the whispered stories about Colonel Blackwood's treatment of female soldiers during training exercises. He pushed them harder than their male counterparts, questioned their abilities openly, and seemed to take particular pleasure in pointing out their perceived weaknesses in front of other soldiers. Several women had requested transfers from his command, but Sarah had refused to back down from the challenge. The training schedule called for hand-to-hand combat demonstrations between soldiers of similar rank and experience levels. Each pair would engage in controlled combat while instructors evaluated their technique, strategy, and overall performance. The exercises were designed to test real-world combat readiness while maintaining safety protocols that prevented serious injuries. As names were called and pairs began their demonstrations, Sarah noticed Colonel Blackwood watching her with unusual interest. His eyes followed her movements as she stretched and prepared for her turn, and she could sense his disapproval radiating across the distance between them. She had learned to ignore such attention over the years, focusing instead on her training and performance. The crowd of soldiers created a wall of olive-green uniforms around the perimeter of the training area. Some sat on wooden bleachers while others stood in formation, all maintaining the disciplined posture expected during official exercises. The energy in the air was electric with anticipation, as these evaluations often provided entertainment alongside their educational value. Sergeant Mike, Sarah's usual training partner, had been assigned to a different exercise rotation that morning. This left Sarah waiting for her name to be called, wondering who would be selected as her opponent for the evaluation. She ran through various combat scenarios in her mind, practicing the techniques she had perfected through hundreds of hours of training. The sound of boots on dirt filled the air as previous pairs completed their demonstrations. Each engagement lasted approximately 5 minutes, giving both participants enough time to showcase their skills while maintaining the schedule needed to evaluate all personnel. Some matches were clearly one-sided, while others provided genuine displays of tactical thinking and physical prowess. Colonel Blackwood moved among the observers, occasionally stopping to speak with other officers or make notes on his evaluation clipboard. His presence added an extra layer of tension to an already challenging situation, as every soldier wanted to perform well under his scrutiny. Sarah noticed how some of the female soldiers seemed particularly nervous when he approached their section of the viewing area. The morning progressed steadily through the alphabetical roster of participants. Sarah's surname placed her toward the end of the list, giving her ample time to observe the various fighting styles and techniques being demonstrated. She paid special attention to the defensive strategies that seemed most effective, knowing that her own approach would need to be flawless under such intense observation. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, the temperature inside the training arena began to rise noticeably. Soldiers loosened their collar tabs and rolled up their sleeves where regulations permitted, but maintained their professional appearance throughout the proceedings. The combination of physical exertion and Texas heat created a challenging environment that tested everyone's endurance. Finally, the instructor's voice boomed across the training ground, calling out Sarah's name for her evaluation turn. She stepped forward confidently, her heart rate increasing slightly as she entered the designated combat zone. The circle of watching soldiers seemed to close in around her, creating an intimate arena where every movement would be scrutinized and judged. Sarah expected to face another lieutenant or perhaps a sergeant with similar experience levels. The standard protocol called for relatively matched opponents to ensure fair evaluations and meaningful demonstrations of combat skills. She positioned herself in the center of the ring and waited for her assigned partner to be announced. The instructor paused for a moment, glancing toward Colonel Blackwood with what appeared to be uncertainty. A brief conversation occurred between them, too quiet for the surrounding soldiers to hear clearly. Sarah noticed the exchange but maintained her ready position, assuming they were simply clarifying some procedural detail about her evaluation. When Colonel Blackwood himself stepped into the combat ring, a noticeable hush fell over the assembled soldiers. This was highly unusual, as senior officers rarely participated directly in enlisted training exercises. Sarah felt her stomach tighten slightly, but she maintained her composed exterior and professional bearing despite the unexpected development. The colonel removed his rank insignia and officer's jacket, revealing a still muscular build that spoke to years of dedicated physical training. His movements were confident and deliberate as he assumed a combat stance across from Sarah. The intensity in his pale blue eyes suggested this was more than a routine training exercise, though Sarah couldn't yet understand the full implications of what was about to unfold. 282 soldiers watched in absolute silence as the unlikely pair faced each other in the center of the training ring. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife, and everyone present seemed to understand they were about to witness something extraordinary. Sarah took a deep breath and prepared herself for whatever was coming, knowing that her performance in the next few minutes would be remembered for years to come. The silence that fell over the training ground was unlike anything Sarah had experienced in her military career. 282 soldiers held their breath as Colonel Blackwood circled her slowly, his eyes never leaving her face. The morning heat seemed to intensify, creating an almost unbearable tension that pressed down on everyone present. Sarah maintained her defensive stance, her mind racing through the possible reasons for this unprecedented situation. In her 6 years of military service, she had never heard of a senior officer personally engaging in hand-to-hand combat evaluation with an enlisted soldier. The breach of protocol was so significant that several junior officers exchanged worried glances around the perimeter of the ring. "You think you're tough enough for combat duty, Martinez?" Colonel Blackwood's voice carried clearly across the silent training ground. His tone held a mocking edge that made several soldiers shift uncomfortably in their positions. "Let's see if you can handle a real opponent instead of playing games with your fellow recruits." The insult stung, but Sarah had learned years ago not to let emotional reactions compromise her tactical thinking. She knew that Colonel Blackwood was attempting to provoke her into making a mistake, probably hoping to demonstrate her unsuitability for combat roles in front of the entire battalion. His prejudices against female soldiers were well known throughout the base, and this appeared to be his opportunity to make a public statement. Sarah's training kicked in automatically as she assessed her opponent's strengths and weaknesses. Colonel Blackwood possessed significant advantages in height, weight, and upper body strength. However, his age and rank meant he likely spent more time behind a desk than in active training. His movements, while confident, showed subtle signs of decreased flexibility and slower reflexes than she was accustomed to facing. The colonel launched his first attack without warning, attempting to use his size advantage to overwhelm Sarah with brute force. His approach was textbook military combat training from decades past, relying on power and aggression rather than finesse or strategy. Sarah his initial charge smoothly, using his momentum against him as she had been trained to do. The crowd of watching soldiers began to murmur quietly as they realized this was not going to be a standard demonstration. Several sergeants moved closer to the ring, ready to intervene if the situation escalated beyond acceptable training parameters. The unusual nature of the match had everyone on edge, unsure of how they should react to seeing their commanding officer engaged in combat with a subordinate. Colonel Blackwood's face flushed red with anger and embarrassment as his first attack missed completely. He had clearly expected to end the demonstration quickly with a show of overwhelming force, but Sarah's evasive maneuver had left him off balance and exposed. The watching soldiers could see that he was genuinely trying to hurt her, not merely providing a training exercise. Sarah remained calm and focused, drawing on the countless hours she had spent studying different combat styles and defensive techniques. Her instructors had always emphasized the importance of using an opponent's size and aggression against them, lessons that seemed particularly relevant in her current situation. She knew that staying patient and waiting for the right opportunity would serve her better than attempting to match the colonel's aggressive approach. The second attack came faster than the first, as Colonel Blackwood attempted to compensate for his initial failure with increased intensity. This time he tried to grab Sarah's shoulders and use his weight advantage to force her to the ground. His technique was solid but predictable, the kind of move that worked well against inexperienced opponents but could be countered effectively by someone with proper training. Sarah ducked under his reaching arms and moved to his side, striking his ribs with a controlled blow that followed standard combat protocols. The hit was firm enough to demonstrate her capability without causing serious injury, but Colonel Blackwood's reaction suggested he had not expected her to land any significant strikes. His surprise gave her a momentary advantage that she used to create distance between them. The watching soldiers could see that the dynamics of the fight were not developing as anyone had expected. Several officers near the ring began to look genuinely concerned about the situation, realizing that their commanding officer's reputation was at stake in front of the entire battalion. The impromptu nature of the match meant there were no established rules or safety protocols beyond those governing standard training exercises. Colonel Blackwood's breathing became noticeably heavier as the engagement continued. His years of desk duty were clearly showing, and Sarah could see that his initial burst of aggressive energy was beginning to fade. However, his anger seemed to be increasing rather than diminishing, making him potentially more dangerous as his frustration mounted with each failed attack. The third exchange was the most serious yet, as Colonel Blackwood abandoned any pretense of following training protocols and began fighting with genuine intent to harm. His strikes became wilder and more reckless, driven by rage rather than tactical thinking. Sarah realized that the situation was escalating beyond anything that could be considered appropriate for a training exercise. Sarah's defensive movements became more pronounced as she worked to avoid the colonel's increasingly dangerous attacks. Her training had prepared her for exactly this type of opponent, someone who relied on anger and brute force rather than skill and technique. She knew that his emotional state would eventually create an opening she could exploit, but she needed to survive his assault long enough for that opportunity to present itself. The crowd around the ring had grown completely silent, except for the sound of heavy breathing and the scuff of boots on dirt. Every soldier present understood they were witnessing something that would be talked about for years to come, regardless of how it ended. The tension was almost unbearable as they watched their commanding officer become increasingly desperate in his attempts to overpower the young lieutenant. Sarah noticed that Colonel Blackwood was beginning to favor his left side slightly, probably due to the rib strike she had landed earlier. This small weakness gave her valuable information about how to proceed, but she knew she needed to be careful not to escalate the situation further. Her goal was to survive the encounter with her reputation intact, not to humiliate a senior officer in front of the entire battalion. The fourth attack was Colonel Blackwood's most committed yet, as he threw his entire body weight into what appeared to be a final desperate attempt to end the fight on his terms. His approach was so reckless that several watching soldiers instinctively stepped forward, thinking he might seriously injure himself or Sarah in the process. The move telegraphed his intentions so clearly that Sarah had several seconds to prepare her response. This was the moment Sarah had been waiting for throughout the entire encounter. Colonel Blackwood's overcommitment to his attack left him completely vulnerable to a countermove, and her training had prepared her to recognize and exploit exactly this type of opportunity. She could see the perfect opening developing as he charged toward her with all of his remaining strength and energy. The watching soldiers held their collective breath as they realized that the next few seconds would determine the outcome of this unprecedented confrontation. 282 pairs of eyes focused intently on the center of the ring, where a young lieutenant was about to demonstrate exactly why she deserved to serve in combat roles alongside her male counterparts. Sarah's mind became crystal clear as years of training and preparation culminated in this single moment. Every technique she had learned, every hour she had spent perfecting her skills, and every challenge she had overcome led to this opportunity to prove herself in the most public way possible. The future of her military career hung in the balance as Colonel Blackwood's final attack approached its climax. Time seemed to slow to a crawl as Colonel Blackwood committed fully to his final attack. Sarah could see every detail of his approach with perfect clarity, the wild determination in his pale blue eyes, the way his weight shifted forward onto his left foot, the slight tremor in his hands that revealed his exhaustion and mounting desperation. This was the moment that would define everything that followed. The technique Sarah employed was one she had practiced thousands of times in training facilities around the world. Called an arm drag to hip toss in military combat manuals, it was designed specifically to use an opponent's momentum and aggression against them. The move required perfect timing, precise positioning, and complete commitment to the execution. There was no room for hesitation or second thoughts. As Colonel Blackwood lunged toward her with his right arm extended in what appeared to be an attempt to grab her throat, Sarah stepped slightly to her left while simultaneously grabbing his wrist with both hands. The motion redirected his forward momentum while pulling him off balance, exactly as the technique was designed to do. His own body weight and speed became weapons turned against him. Sarah's left foot swept behind the colonel's leading leg while her hands maintained their grip on his extended arm. The combination of forces created a leverage point that physics made impossible for him to resist, regardless of his size advantage. His own charging momentum became the energy that drove him toward the ground, amplified by Sarah's perfectly executed countermove. The watching soldiers could see exactly what was happening, but the speed of execution made it appear almost magical. One moment Colonel Blackwood was charging forward with apparent control of the situation, and the next moment he was airborne and completely helpless. The transition happened so smoothly that several observers would later claim they missed the actual technique entirely. Colonel Blackwood's expression changed from aggressive confidence to shock, and then to fear as he realized what was happening to him. His feet left the ground as the hip toss reached its completion, and he found himself completely at the mercy of forces beyond his control. The helplessness he felt was visible to everyone watching, a dramatic reversal from his earlier dominance of the encounter. Sarah maintained perfect control throughout the execution of the technique, ensuring that Colonel Blackwood's impact with the ground would be forceful enough to end the confrontation, but not severe enough to cause permanent injury. Her training had emphasized the importance of controlled application of force, using only what was necessary to neutralize an opponent's ability to continue fighting. The sound of Colonel Blackwood hitting the packed dirt surface of the training ring echoed across the silent gathering like a thunderclap. 282 soldiers watched in stunned amazement as their commanding officer found himself flat on his back, completely winded and momentarily unable to move. The impact had knocked the breath from his lungs and left him staring up at the Texas sky in complete bewilderment. Sarah immediately stepped back and assumed a defensive position, following proper combat protocols even though the threat had been neutralized. Her breathing remained controlled and steady, showing no signs of the exertion that had left Colonel Blackwood gasping for air on the ground. The contrast between their conditions was stark and impossible for anyone present to ignore. For several seconds, the only sound in the training arena was Colonel Blackwood's labored breathing as he struggled to regain his composure. The watching soldiers remained frozen in place, unsure of how they should react to witnessing their commanding officer's decisive defeat at the hands of a subordinate. The unprecedented nature of the situation left everyone without a clear protocol to follow. Colonel Blackwood's attempt to rise from the ground revealed the extent to which the encounter had affected him. His movements were slow and unsteady, and his face had turned an alarming shade of red that spoke to both physical exertion and emotional humiliation. The man who had entered the ring with such confidence now appeared vulnerable and defeated in front of his entire command. However, the humiliation of being thrown to the ground was not sufficient to extinguish the colonel's anger. If anything, his rage seemed to intensify as the reality of his situation became clear. The watching soldiers could see fury building in his eyes as he struggled to his feet, his pride wounded far more severely than his body had been by the impact with the ground. Sarah recognized the dangerous signs of an opponent who had been pushed beyond rational thinking. Her training had taught her that humiliated adversaries often became more dangerous rather than less so, abandoning tactical thinking in favor of desperate attempts to regain their perceived honor. She maintained her ready position and prepared for whatever might come next. Colonel Blackwood finally managed to stand upright, though his breathing remained labored and his balance appeared uncertain. The watching soldiers could see that he was struggling with the reality of what had just occurred, his worldview challenged by the undeniable evidence of Sarah's superior combat skills. The cognitive dissonance was written clearly across his flushed features. Rather than accepting defeat gracefully or acknowledging Sarah's skill, Colonel Blackwood's response revealed the depth of his prejudices and the fragility of his ego. His face contorted with renewed rage as he prepared to launch another attack, this one driven purely by wounded pride rather than any tactical consideration. The watching soldiers could sense that something even more dangerous was about to unfold. Sarah saw the attack coming before Colonel Blackwood had fully committed to it. His body language telegraphed his intentions clearly, and his emotional state made him predictable in a way that tactical thinking never could. She knew that this second engagement would likely be even more reckless than the first, driven by desperation rather than confidence. The colonel's renewed assault was exactly as wild and uncontrolled as Sarah had predicted. His movements lacked any semblance of proper technique as he charged toward her with his right fist raised, apparently intending to strike her in the face with enough force to cause serious injury. The attack was so obviously telegraphed that Sarah had several seconds to plan her response. This time, Sarah's defensive move was even more decisive than the first. As Colonel Blackwood swung his right fist toward her head, she ducked under his arm while simultaneously grabbing his wrist and elbow. The motion put her in perfect position to apply an arm bar technique that would give her complete control over his movement and ability to continue fighting. The execution of the arm bar was flawless, a textbook demonstration of how proper technique could overcome superior size and strength. Sarah's grip on Colonel Blackwood's arm put tremendous pressure on his elbow joint while forcing him into an awkward position that made it impossible for him to generate any meaningful resistance. His own anatomy became the tool that ensured his defeat. The watching soldiers could see that Sarah had achieved total control of the situation. Colonel Blackwood was bent forward at an uncomfortable angle, his arm twisted behind his back in a position that made any movement painful and potentially dangerous. His face showed a mixture of pain, surprise, and dawning realization that he was completely helpless. For a moment, it appeared that the confrontation might end there, with Colonel Blackwood forced to acknowledge his defeat and submit to Sarah's superior skill. The watching crowd held its collective breath, waiting to see if their commanding officer would have the wisdom to accept the reality of his situation and end the encounter with whatever dignity remained available to him. However, Colonel Blackwood's pride and prejudices ran too deep to allow for rational decision-making. Instead of submitting to the arm bar and ending the confrontation, he made one final desperate attempt to turn the situation in his favor. His decision to continue fighting despite being in a completely disadvantageous position would have consequences that no one present could have predicted. The colonel attempted to use his weight advantage to break free from Sarah's grip, twisting his body violently in an effort to escape the arm bar. The movement was exactly the wrong thing to do while caught in such a hold, as it put tremendous additional stress on his elbow joint. Sarah tried to release the pressure to prevent injury, but his violent movement made it impossible for her to let go safely. The sound that followed was unlike anything most of the watching soldiers had ever heard, a sharp crack that echoed across the training ground like a gunshot. Colonel Blackwood's scream of pain confirmed what everyone feared had happened, and the sudden way his body went limp revealed the extent of the damage that had been done to his arm. The sharp crack that echoed across the training ground was followed by a moment of absolute silence that seemed to stretch for an eternity. 282 soldiers stood frozen in place, their minds struggling to process what they had just witnessed. Colonel Blackwood's agonized scream shattered the quiet, leaving no doubt about the severity of what had occurred. Sarah immediately released her grip and stepped back, her face showing genuine concern despite the circumstances that had led to this moment. Her training had taught her to apply controlled force, but Colonel Blackwood's violent attempt to escape the arm bar had created forces beyond anyone's ability to control. The injury was the result of his own actions rather than any intent on her part to cause harm. Colonel Blackwood collapsed to his knees, clutching his right arm against his body while his face contorted in obvious agony. The arm hung at an unnatural angle that made several of the watching soldiers look away in discomfort. His breathing came in short, ragged gasps as shock began to set in alongside the physical pain of his injury. The medical team stationed at the edge of the training ground rushed into action with practiced efficiency. Sergeant Williams, the senior medic, reached Colonel Blackwood's side within seconds, while his assistants cleared a path through the crowd of stunned soldiers. Their professional demeanor provided a stark contrast to the chaos and confusion that had erupted around the training ring. "Nobody move," Sergeant Williams shouted as he began his initial assessment of the injury. "Give us space to work." The authority in his voice broke through the shock that had paralyzed most of the observers, and soldiers began to step back to create the room the medical team needed to provide proper care. Sarah remained where she was, knowing that her immediate cooperation with any investigation would be crucial. Several officers were already moving toward her position, their faces showing a mixture of concern, confusion, and barely contained anger. The unprecedented nature of the situation had left everyone without clear protocols to follow. Major, the senior officer present besides Colonel Blackwood, took charge of the scene with admirable composure given the circumstances. "Sergeant, secure the training area," he ordered. "Nobody leaves until we understand exactly what happened here. Lieutenant Martinez, remain in position until further notice." The crowd of soldiers began to organize itself under Major's direction, though the atmosphere remained thick with tension and uncertainty. Conversations erupted in whispers throughout the gathered troops as everyone tried to make sense of what they had witnessed. Some soldiers appeared sympathetic to Sarah's situation, while others seemed shocked that a subordinate had injured a senior officer. Sergeant Williams worked quickly to stabilize Colonel Blackwood's arm using a field splint and sling arrangement designed for transport to proper medical facilities. The colonel's face had gone pale as shock set in, but he remained conscious and alert throughout the treatment process. His eyes never left Sarah's face, burning with a mixture of pain, rage, and wounded pride. "We need to get him to the base hospital immediately," Sergeant Williams announced as he completed his field treatment. "This is definitely a serious fracture that requires surgical evaluation." Two soldiers moved forward with a stretcher while the medic continued to monitor the colonel's vital signs and pain levels. As the medical team prepared Colonel Blackwood for transport, Major approached Sarah with a grim expression that revealed nothing about his thoughts or intentions. The next few minutes would determine whether she would be treated as the victim of an unprovoked attack or as a subordinate who had injured her commanding officer during what should have been a routine training exercise. "Lieutenant Martinez," Major began, his voice carefully neutral, "I need you to provide a complete account of what occurred here, starting from the moment you entered the training ring. Your statement will be recorded and may be used in any subsequent investigation or disciplinary proceedings." Sarah straightened to attention and began her account in the clear, factual tone she had learned to use when providing military reports. "Sir, I was called for my scheduled combat evaluation and entered the ring expecting to face an opponent of similar rank and experience. Colonel Blackwood entered the ring and initiated combat without following standard training protocols." The watching soldiers listened intently as Sarah continued her account, describing each phase of the encounter in precise detail. Her ability to maintain composure and provide accurate information despite the stress of the situation impressed many of the observers, demonstrating the professionalism that had earned her respect throughout her military career. "Colonel Blackwood's attacks were more aggressive than normal training procedures," Sarah continued, "and appeared intended to cause actual harm rather than demonstrate technique. I used defensive measures consistent with my training to neutralize his attacks. The injury occurred when he attempted to break free from a properly applied arm bar using excessive force." Major nodded as he took notes, occasionally asking for clarification about specific details of the encounter. His questions were professional and focused on establishing an accurate timeline of events rather than assigning blame or responsibility. Several other officers had joined the group, all taking careful notes about Sarah's statement. The process of loading Colonel Blackwood onto the stretcher created a temporary distraction as the medical team worked to move him safely without causing additional injury. His pain medication had begun to take effect, reducing his ability to protest or make statements about the incident. The watching soldiers could see that his condition was serious enough to require immediate medical attention. As the stretcher team carried Colonel Blackwood toward the waiting ambulance, He managed to raise his head enough to fix Sarah with a stare that promised this incident would not be forgotten or forgiven. The hatred in his eyes was visible to everyone nearby, making it clear that he blamed her entirely for what had occurred despite his role in escalating the confrontation. Major concluded his initial interview with Sarah and turned to address the assembled soldiers. "This training exercise is concluded," he announced. "All personnel will return to their regular duties while this incident is investigated according to military regulations. Anyone with relevant information should report to my office within the next 24 hours." The crowd began to disperse slowly, with soldiers breaking into small groups to discuss what they had witnessed. The consensus among most observers was that Sarah had acted defensively throughout the encounter, and that Colonel Blackwood's injury was the result of his own aggressive actions rather than any misconduct on her part. Sarah remained in the training ring as the other soldiers departed, waiting for further instructions while replaying the entire incident in her mind. She knew that the next few days would determine the future of her military career, and she needed to be prepared for whatever accusations or charges might be brought against her. Sergeant approached Sarah with a look of genuine concern on his weathered face. As her usual training partner, he had witnessed her skills and character over many months of working together. "That was textbook defensive combat, Lieutenant," he said quietly. "You did everything by the book, and everyone here saw what really happened." The support from Sergeant was encouraging, but Sarah knew that the official investigation would focus on facts rather than opinions. The testimony of the 282 soldiers who had witnessed the incident would be crucial in establishing exactly what had occurred and who bore responsibility for the outcome. As the training ground emptied and the sounds of normal base operations resumed in the distance, Sarah found herself alone with the knowledge that she had crossed a line from which there might be no return. Her actions had been defensive and appropriate, but the consequences would extend far beyond the physical injury to Colonel Blackwood's arm. The incident would become a defining moment not just for Sarah's career, but for the ongoing debate about women in combat roles throughout the military. The fact that a female lieutenant had defeated and injured a male colonel in hand-to-hand combat would have implications that reached far beyond Camp Henderson and the immediate participants. Sarah took a deep breath and prepared herself for whatever challenges lay ahead, knowing that her performance in the coming investigation would be as important as her actions in the training ring had been. The battle for her military career was just beginning, and the stakes could not have been higher. The investigation that followed the training ground incident was the most thorough and comprehensive review in Camp Henderson's recent history. Major assembled a panel of senior officers from outside the base to ensure impartiality, recognizing that the unusual circumstances required extraordinary measures to maintain credibility and fairness. Over the next 72 hours, investigators interviewed all 282 soldiers who had witnessed the confrontation. The consistency of their testimonies painted a clear picture of what had occurred, with virtually every witness confirming that Colonel Blackwood had initiated the encounter and escalated it beyond normal training parameters. Private First Class Johnson, one of the younger soldiers present, provided particularly compelling testimony about the atmosphere before the incident began. "Colonel Blackwood seemed angry even before he entered the ring," Johnson reported. "His body language and facial expression suggested he had already decided to prove some kind of point rather than conduct a normal training evaluation." Sergeant Martinez, no relation to Sarah despite sharing a surname, described the colonel's fighting style as reckless and emotionally driven rather than tactically sound. Her testimony carried significant weight due to her role as a senior combat instructor with 15 years of experience evaluating military hand-to-hand combat techniques. The video evidence from the training ground security cameras provided objective confirmation of the witness testimonies. Frame-by-frame analysis showed clearly that Colonel Blackwood had initiated each phase of the confrontation, and that Sarah had responded with textbook defensive techniques throughout the encounter. The footage eliminated any possibility of conflicting interpretations about who had been the aggressor. Medical examination of Colonel Blackwood's injury revealed a complete fracture of the ulna and radius bones in his right forearm, requiring surgical repair with metal plates and screws. The orthopedic surgeon's report confirmed that the injury was consistent with the violent twisting motion witnesses had described. rather than excessive force applied by Sarah during the arm bar technique. Dr. Hayes, the base psychiatrist, conducted interviews with both participants to assess their mental states and motivations during the incident. Her evaluation of Sarah revealed no signs of aggression or intent to cause harm, while noting her exceptional ability to maintain composure under extreme stress. The report praised Sarah's professionalism and emotional control throughout the encounter. Colonel Blackwood's psychological evaluation painted a different picture entirely. Dr. Hayes documented a pattern of deeply ingrained prejudices against women in military roles, combined with an inflated sense of personal superiority and an inability to accept challenges to his authority. Her report suggested that these factors had contributed directly to his decision to engage in the confrontation. The legal review conducted by the base's Judge Advocate General's office concluded that Sarah had acted within the bounds of appropriate self-defense throughout the incident. Their analysis emphasized that she had used only the minimum force necessary to neutralize each attack and had attempted to de-escalate the situation whenever possible. Major General Williams, the commanding officer of the entire military district, arrived at Camp Henderson on the fourth day after the incident to personally review the investigation findings. Her presence signaled the high level of attention the case had attracted within military leadership circles, particularly given its implications for gender integration policies. The formal hearing convened in the base's main conference room with all relevant parties present, except Colonel Blackwood, who remained hospitalized for additional surgery to repair nerve damage discovered during the initial operation. His absence actually helped maintain focus on the factual evidence rather than allowing emotional confrontations to influence the proceedings. Sarah's military attorney, Captain David, presented a comprehensive defense that relied primarily on the overwhelming witness testimony and video evidence. His strategy emphasized Sarah's exemplary military record and the obvious disparity between her defensive actions and Colonel Blackwood's aggressive behavior throughout the encounter. The hearing panel's questions focused on military protocol and whether proper procedures had been followed during the training exercise. Their inquiry revealed that Colonel Blackwood had violated several regulations by engaging in combat with a subordinate without proper authorization or safety oversight, further strengthening Sarah's position. Captain's presentation included character testimony from Sarah's previous commanders, fellow soldiers, and training instructors. The unanimous praise for her professionalism, skill, and leadership potential created a stark contrast with the picture of Colonel Blackwood that had emerged from the investigation. The panel's deliberation lasted less than 2 hours before they reached a unanimous conclusion. Major General Williams announced that Sarah would face no disciplinary action for the incident, emphasizing that she had acted appropriately in defending herself against an unprovoked attack by a superior officer who had violated multiple military regulations. Colonel Blackwood faced a different outcome entirely. The investigation recommended formal court-martial proceedings for conduct unbecoming an officer, assault, and violation of training safety protocols. His military career, spanning nearly 3 decades, appeared to be ending in disgrace due to his own prejudices and poor judgment. The broader implications of the incident extended far beyond the immediate participants. Military leadership used the case as an example of why gender integration policies were necessary and effective, pointing to Sarah's professional conduct under extreme pressure as evidence that women could handle combat situations with appropriate training and preparation. Sarah's reputation throughout the military was enhanced rather than damaged by the incident. Her ability to defeat a larger, stronger opponent using superior technique rather than aggression became a training example used in combat courses across multiple bases. Recruitment materials began featuring her story as evidence of opportunities available to women in modern military service. The 282 soldiers who witnessed the incident carried the story throughout their subsequent assignments, spreading Sarah's reputation across the entire military system. Many reported that the experience had changed their own attitudes about women in combat roles, seeing first-hand evidence of capability that contradicted previous assumptions. Colonel Blackwood's medical recovery proved more complicated than initially expected. Nerve damage in his arm resulted in permanent loss of function that ended his military career even before the court-martial proceedings could be completed. His forced medical retirement carried a reduction in rank and benefits that reflected the serious nature of his conduct violations. Sarah received promotion to captain 6 months ahead of her normal schedule, along with assignment to an elite special operations training program that had previously been closed to women. Her selection for the prestigious program was based solely on merit and performance evaluations, but the training ground incident had certainly enhanced her reputation among senior military leaders. The changes in military culture that followed the incident were subtle but significant. Training protocols were updated to include specific provisions for gender integration and harassment prevention, with Sarah's experience serving as a case study for proper and improper conduct during training exercises. 3 years later, now Captain Sarah Martinez served as a combat instructor at the Army's elite Ranger training facility, where she taught both male and female soldiers the same techniques she had used to defend herself that day at Camp Henderson. Her classes consistently received the highest evaluations from participants who appreciated her combination of technical skill and professional demeanor. The training ground where the incident occurred was eventually renamed Martinez Field in recognition of Sarah's contribution to advancing military gender integration policies. A small plaque near the entrance honored her demonstration that skill, training, and professionalism were more important than physical size or traditional prejudices in determining combat effectiveness. Colonel Blackwood disappeared from military circles entirely after his medical discharge, his name remembered primarily as a cautionary example of how prejudice and poor judgment could destroy a career in a matter of minutes. The contrast with Sarah's rising trajectory served as a powerful reminder that character and conduct ultimately determine success more than rank or position. The incident became a turning point not just for Sarah's individual career, but for military policies regarding women in combat roles throughout the armed services. The clear evidence of her capability under extreme pressure helped accelerate policy changes that opened previously restricted positions to qualified women regardless of gender. Sarah's story continued to inspire new generations of female soldiers who saw in her example proof that determination, training, and professionalism could overcome any obstacle. The training ground incident had transformed a moment of confrontation into a catalyst for positive change that extended far beyond anyone's expectations on that hot morning at Camp Henderson.